The clink of silverware against porcelain was a symphony she knew by heart. Amara moved through the maze of tables at Aria, a restaurant so exclusive it felt less like a place to eat and more like a stage. Each step was precise, each movement economical. She was a professional, a ghost in a crisp black uniform, there to facilitate an experience, not to have one. Her section tonight was the corner booth, the one tucked away in shadow, reserved for guests who valued privacy above all else. And tonight it was occupied by him. She had noticed him the moment he walked in.
It was impossible not to.
He wore a custom Tom Ford suit, the charcoal wool so perfectly tailored it seemed less like fabric and more like a second skin. He moved like the room owed him space, a quiet, predatory grace that made the air around him feel thin. He was with a group, 2 other men and a woman, all of them possessing the same aura of untouchable wealth and coiled stillness. They spoke only in Korean, their voices low and smooth, a river of sound that flowed around her without meaning. Amara placed a bottle of sparkling water on the table, her movements fluid. "Would you care for another bottle of the Saint-Emilion?" she asked, her voice calm and even, directed at the man who seemed to be the center of their universe. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian chips, lifted to meet hers for a fraction of a second. There was no warmth in them, only assessment. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. She retrieved the bottle, her training kicking in, a shield against the unnerving intensity of his presence.
She knew her job.
Refill the water, open the wine, describe the specials, remain invisible. She was good at it. It was a skill honed by years of navigating spaces where her body, full and dark and unapologetically present, was often seen as an intrusion. Here, her professionalism was her armor. As she decanted the wine, letting the deep red liquid breathe, the conversation at the table resumed. The woman, draped in silk and diamonds, laughed at something one of the men said. Amara didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone. It was dismissive. She felt their eyes on her back as she leaned over to pour the wine for the woman first. Then she heard it, a phrase from one of the other men, sharp and guttural. It was a crude comment, a dismissive remark about her size, followed by a snicker. Amara's hand didn't falter. The stream of wine flowing into the glass remained steady, a perfect pour. She had heard worse, in languages she understood perfectly well. It was the price of admission for existing in her skin. She kept her expression placid, her posture serene.
She was a ghost.
She was invisible. She moved to the head of the table, to him. As she began to pour his wine, he spoke. His voice was different from the others. It was quieter, a low baritone that cut through the low hum of the restaurant. He wasn't speaking to her, but to his companions. "Let it be," he said in Korean. "You cannot expect discipline from such things. They're slow. It is their nature." The insult was not like the other man's. It was not a crude jab at her body. It was worse. It was a clinical dismissal of her humanity, of her competence. He had looked right at her, and then spoken as if she were a piece of furniture, incapable of thought, of understanding, of dignity.
Slow.
Undisciplined. An object. Something inside her, a coil of pride she kept tightly wound, snapped. She finished pouring his wine, the ruby liquid cresting just below the widest part of the bowl. She placed the bottle on the table with a soft, deliberate click. The sound seemed to cut through their conversation, drawing their attention. For the first time all evening, all 4 of them were looking at her. The air grew thick with their silent expectation. Amara straightened to her full height. She did not look at his companions. She looked directly at him, into those cold, obsidian eyes that held the flat, placid surface of a frozen lake. And then she spoke. Her Korean was flawless, the syllables crisp and formal, a stark contrast to their casual, dismissive slang. "A man who must belittle a stranger to feel powerful in front of his friends," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of steel, "is not a powerful man. He is a coward." Silence. It was absolute. The kind of silence that swallows all other sound, that presses in on you from all sides. The woman's perfectly painted mouth hung slightly open. The two men stared, their arrogance wiped clean from their faces, replaced by pure shock. But he did not look shocked. He looked intrigued. A flicker of something that wasn't anger, but a cold, calculating curiosity sparked in the depths of his eyes. He tilted his head, a slow, deliberate movement. The predatory stillness she had sensed earlier was no longer passive. It was focused. It was on her. He lifted his glass, swirled the wine, and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. He set the glass down. Then, still speaking in Korean, he addressed his companions without looking away from Amara. The evening is over. Leave. There was no argument. The other three rose as if pulled by invisible strings, their shock morphing into a nervous deference. They gathered their things, casting wide-eyed, fearful glances at Amara, and then they were gone, melting back into the shadows of the restaurant.
Now it was just the two of them.
The table between them felt like a battlefield. The silence stretched, thin and sharp. "What is your name?" he asked. He had switched to English. His accent was faint, almost non-existent. "Amara," she said. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but her voice was steady. "Amara," he repeated, tasting the syllables. He said her name differently than anyone else had. It was not a question.
It was a statement.
A claim. He gestured to the chair opposite him.
"Seat."
"My shift isn't over." It was a weak protest, but it was all she had. "Your shift is over," he said, the finality in his tone leaving no room for debate. "You work for me now. Sit down." The floor had just dropped out from under her world. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was not a request. It was an edict. Her old life had ended the moment she decided to speak back. The last of the patrons had trickled out, leaving Arya in the hushed state of pre-closing. Her manager, a perpetually nervous man named Julian, approached the table, his face pale. He glanced from the silent, imposing figure of Kwon Min-jun to Amara, who remained standing. "Is there a problem, sir?" Julian asked, his voice trembling slightly. Min-jun didn't even look at him. His gaze remained locked on Amara. "There is no problem. The restaurant is closed. You may leave. She is staying." Julian looked at Amara, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and apology. "Amara," he whispered, "just do what he says." He scurried away, grabbing his coat, eager to be free of the suffocating tension that had claimed the room. The staff followed, a quiet exodus that left Amara utterly alone with the man who had just dismantled her life with a few words. She finally sat. The leather of the booth was cool against her skin. He watched her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't smiling. He was simply observing, like a biologist studying a new and fascinating specimen. "How?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "The language. You speak it with a scholar's precision." "I studied it in college," she said, deciding that the truth, or a version of it, was her only weapon. "I was in a translation program." I couldn't afford to finish." The admission felt like a surrender, a crack in her armor. He seemed to consider this, turning it over in his mind. A translator. Interesting. A person who understands the weight of words. And yet you chose yours so recklessly. "You assumed I was deaf and dumb," she countered, a spark of her earlier fire returning. "I corrected you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You did more than that. You challenged me. In my world, challenges have consequences." His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, his focus shifting for a moment. He rose from the booth with that same fluid grace. "We are leaving." "Where are we going?" "To continue our conversation in a more private setting," he said, holding out a hand not to her, but to indicate the path to the door. "My car is outside." She walked ahead of him, intensely aware of his presence behind her, a silent, looming shadow. The car was a black Maybach, so sleek and silent it seemed to absorb the light from the street lamps. A driver held the door open. Inside, the world was muted. The scent of expensive leather and something else, a subtle cologne with a note of cedar and smoke, filled the small space. It was a cage, but a luxurious one. They drove in silence through the glittering city. Amara watched the familiar streets blur into ribbons of light, feeling more disconnected from them than she ever had before. They were heading downtown, toward the forest of steel and glass skyscrapers that pierced the night sky. The car descended into a private underground garage and stopped before a private elevator. The penthouse was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city, a carpet of diamonds laid out at their feet. The space was minimalist, decorated in shades of charcoal, black and cream. It was beautiful, but cold. A museum, not a home. "Drink?" he asked, moving toward a bar that was better stocked than the one at Aria. "No, thank you." He poured himself a short glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. He turned to face her, leaning against the bar. "You are not afraid," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You should be." "Being afraid doesn't seem like it would be very helpful right now," she replied, her voice more stable than she felt. He took a step closer. "Tell me about yourself, Amara." The translator, who couldn't afford to finish her degree. What does a person like that do, waiting tables for men who insult her? "She survives," Amara said simply. "She pays her bills. She keeps her head down and does her job. Until tonight." "Until tonight," she agreed. His eyes scanned the room, and for a moment his focus softened. His gaze landed on a small, silver-framed photograph on a bookshelf. Amara followed his line of sight. It was a picture of a woman, her hair long and dark, a bright, genuine smile on her face. She was beautiful. Minjun saw her looking. The cold mask he wore shifted, and for a split second, a deep, profound sadness clouded his features. It was there and gone so quickly, she might have imagined it. "She was my wife," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion she had just seen in his eyes. "Her name was Suj." Amara said nothing. There was nothing to say. "She was killed," he continued, turning the whiskey glass in his hand. "An accident. A car bomb meant for me. Someone was careless. A bodyguard failed to check the vehicle properly. A simple, careless mistake." He looked from the photo back to Amara, and his eyes were hard again. "I do not tolerate carelessness. It costs too much. It creates debts that can never be repaid." The implication was clear. Her careless act of speaking back, of drawing his attention, was a liability in his world. She had stepped into a place where a single mistake could get you killed. That was his wound. The woman he had failed to protect. And now he saw carelessness everywhere. Suddenly, a small, red, appeared on the marble floor between them. It quivered, then began to travel upward, crawling up the leg of the sofa. A sniper's laser. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Minjun moved with an impossible, silent speed. He didn't shout or panic. One hand swept the whiskey glass off the bar, sending it shattering to the floor, while the other reached for something tucked into the back of his waistband. But the laser was already climbing, heading for his chest. There was no time to think. Amara acted on pure, primal instinct. A tall, elegant floor lamp stood beside her. In one motion, she shoved it with all her strength. It crashed to the ground, the bulb exploding with a loud pop, plunging the massive room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the distant, glittering city beyond the windows. The red vanished. In the disorienting blackness, she felt a hand clamp down on her arm. It wasn't violent, but the grip was unbreakable steel. He pulled her down, hard, behind the thick marble of the bar. Her body collided with his, the impact jarring. She was pressed against the solid wall of his chest, her face buried in the fine wool of his suit. She could feel the steady, calm beat of his heart against her cheek. It was a shocking contrast to the frantic racing of her own. He was a shield, a wall of muscle and resolve between her and the danger outside. He leaned in, his lips so close to her ear she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Stay down," he whispered, the command a low vibration that seemed to travel straight through her. "Do not move." They stayed there, crouched in the dark, for what felt like an eternity. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their breathing. He had not thanked her. He had not acknowledged what she did. But the grip on her arm, which had been pure iron, gentled almost imperceptibly. It was no longer a restraint. It was an anchor. In that moment, crouched in the dark with a killer, she had never felt safer in her life. The immediate danger passed as quickly as it had arrived. Minjun spoke quietly into a watch that Amara now realized was a communication device. His Korean was clipped, precise, a series of commands that sent unseen forces into motion. Within minutes, the threat was neutralized. A team of his men, dressed in the same dark, impeccably tailored suits, swept through the penthouse, their movements silent and efficient. The broken lamp was cleared away, the shattered glass gone as if it had never existed. The lights came back on, but the mood in the room had irrevocably changed. Amara was sitting on the plush sofa, a blanket she didn't remember being given draped over her shoulders. Minjun stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city that was his kingdom. "They saw you," he said, without turning around. "They were watching the restaurant. They followed us. They saw you come up here with me." Amara clutched the blanket tighter. "What does that mean?" He finally turned to face her. His expression was grim. "It means you are now a person of interest to my enemies. They will assume you are important to me. A leverage point. A weakness." He paused, his eyes boring into hers. "Leaving is no longer an option. You are safer here, with me, than you are anywhere else in this city. Your old life is a liability." The gilded cage had just become her only sanctuary. The choice to stay was no longer hers to make. It had been made for her by a sniper's bullet she had helped him dodge. Days bled into a strange, new routine. She lived in the sterile beauty of his penthouse, a prisoner of circumstance. She had a room with a view that could break your heart and a closet filled with clothes in her size that had appeared overnight. He was often gone, disappearing for hours or days at a time, leaving her in the care of a silent, watchful housekeeper and the ever-present security team. But when he was there, the air crackled with a tension that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He would find her in the library, where she devoured books she'd never been able to afford. He would watch her, his expression unreadable, as she sketched the city skyline in a notebook she'd found. They rarely spoke of what had happened. They spoke of literature, of history, of art. He was fiercely intelligent, his mind as sharp and tactical in a discussion about Renaissance poetry as it surely was in a boardroom or a back-alley deal. She was beginning to see the man beneath the monster, and it scared her more than the monster ever had. The first time he let her leave the penthouse was a week later. It was a calculated risk. An art gallery benefit, a public appearance he could not miss. "You will be my translator," he'd said. It was a lie. He needed no translator. He was putting her on display, a deliberate move in the chess game he was playing with his rivals. She wore a gown of emerald silk that clung to her curves, a dress that made her feel both powerful and exposed. Two of his best men, Jae and Hyun, were their shadow. The gallery was a crush of wealth and power, a different kind of jungle. Amara stayed close to Minjun, her senses on high alert. It happened as they were leaving. Their car was brought around to a private exit. As Jae opened the door for her, a black van screeched around the corner, blocking their path. Two men jumped out, moving with brutal efficiency. One grabbed her, his hand rough on her arm, while the other engaged Jae. Amara screamed, not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated rage. She drove her heel into her captor's instep, hard. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It wasn't enough. He dragged her toward the van. She could see Minjun, a blur of motion as he and Hyun moved to intercept, but there were too many of them. The van door slid open. Hands reached out to pull her in. For a terrifying, heart-stopping moment, she thought it was over. She saw Minjun's face across the chaos of the fight. The mask of cold control was gone. In its place was a raw, primal fear. It was the look of a man watching his world burn down for a second time. Then he was there. He moved through the fray not like a man, but like a force of nature. It was a storm of controlled, lethal violence. One moment her attacker was pulling her into the van, the next he was on the ground, silenced by a single, precise strike from Minjun. The fight was over in seconds. He reached her, his hands checking her for injuries, his touch frantic and unsteady. It was the first time she had ever seen him lose his composure. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a raw rasp. "No," she breathed, her body trembling with adrenaline. His relief was a visible thing, a wave that washed over him, leaving his shoulders slumped for a bare second before they squared again. He pulled her behind him, shielding her as his men secured the area. One of the attackers was still alive, pinned to the ground by Jay. He was gasping, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "He'll know you failed." The man sneered at Minjun. "He'll know your weakness." Jay pulled out a weapon, its silencer a dark O against the city lights. He was going to execute him right there in the alley. Minjun was distracted, his attention focused on getting Amara into the safety of the car. But Amara saw it. The attacker, pinned under Jay's knee, was subtly shifting his weight, his hand creeping toward a small pistol tucked into an ankle holster. No one else saw it.
"Minyon."
Amara shouted, her voice sharp with panic. She didn't know what else to do. She threw the only thing she had, her small, beaded clutch purse. It sailed through the air, hitting the wall just behind Jay with a clatter. The sound was just enough of a diversion. Jay's head snapped toward the noise for a split second. In that instant, he saw the man's hand moving. He reacted instantly, neutralizing the threat before the man could draw his weapon. The alley fell silent again, the only sound the distant wail of sirens. Amara stood frozen. She had not pulled a trigger, but she had participated. She had seen a threat and, instead of cowering, she had created an opening for a man to be killed. She had crossed a line. She could never go back. Back in the penthouse, the silence was heavy and suffocating. Amara stood by the window, wrapping her arms around herself. Minjun came up behind her. He had a first aid kit in his hands. "You have a cut," he said softly. He was right. A thin line of red was welling on her forearm, scraped during the struggle. She hadn't even felt it. She let him lead her to the sofa. He sat beside her, his touch surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound. His fingers were clinical, but they sent a jolt of electricity through her skin. "You should have run the first night," he said, his voice low, his eyes focused on his task. "When you knocked over the lamp, you had a chance." Amara watched his dark head bent over her arm. She could smell the cedar and smoke of his cologne, mingled now with the faint, metallic scent of blood. "I told myself it was for survival," she whispered, the words tasting like a confession. "To stay close to the most dangerous thing in the room. But I was lying to myself." He stopped dabbing the cut. He slowly lifted his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. The space between them shimmered with unspoken things. He understood what she was admitting, that this was more than survival now.
It was a choice.
A pull toward the danger, toward him. The next day, a package arrived. It wasn't for him. It was addressed to her, to Amara, at his address. One of his men brought it in, handling it like a bomb. Inside was a small, worn teddy bear. It was the one she'd had since she was 5 years old, the one she kept in a storage unit with the rest of her meager belongings. Tucked into its ear was a Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of the front of her mother's house in a quiet, suburban neighborhood 1,000 miles away. There was no note. There didn't need to be. The message was brutally clear. "We know who you are. We know where you come from. We know who you love." The war was no longer his. It was hers. The photo of her mother's house changed everything. The threat was no longer an abstract concept. It had a face, a front porch, and a garden she remembered planting. Minjun saw the terror in her eyes and reacted with a swift, cold fury of a king whose borders had been breached. He made one phone call, and within hours, Amara's mother was being moved to an undisclosed, secure location by a team of discreet professionals who introduced themselves as representatives from a private security firm. The cost was astronomical. The execution was flawless. Her old life, and the people in it, were now under his control, protected by his empire. The debt she owed him grew heavier. He was planning his retaliation. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he spoke. His meetings became more frequent, his voice on the phone a low, lethal hum. He was preparing for war, and she was the reason. The rival boss, a man named Park, had made a fatal error. He had mistaken her for a weakness. Minjun was going to teach him that he had, in fact, targeted the heart of his fortress. Minjun intended to leave her behind. "You will stay here," he'd commanded, the night his operation was set to launch. "You will be safe." But Amara had not been idle. She had been listening, watching, learning. She understood the rhythms of his organization, the names of his enemies. And something about the threat, about the teddy bear, had lodged in her mind like a splinter. It was too personal, too theatrical. Park was known for his brutality, not his sentimentality. That night, as Minjun and his soldiers prepared to descend on Park's known stronghold in the industrial district, Amara looked again at the Polaroid. The front of her mother's house. It was a simple picture, but something was wrong. In the corner of the frame, barely visible behind a rose bush, was the fender of a car. A vintage, pale blue convertible. It was the kind of detail most people would miss. But Amara had spent hours of her childhood staring out that front window. She knew every car in that neighborhood, and that one did not belong. She remembered overhearing one of his men talking weeks ago, gossiping about Park's one indulgence outside of his brutal business, restoring classic American cars. Her blood ran cold. The stronghold was a feint, a trap. The photo wasn't just a threat, it was a clue, a boast. Park wasn't hiding in a warehouse. He was somewhere that spoke to his ego, to his passions. She found a map of the city, her hands shaking. There was a classic car club, an exclusive garage for enthusiasts, on the other side of town. It was housed in a renovated theater, a place of drama and spectacle, the kind of place a man like Park would choose for his final stand. Minjun was already gone. His comms were silent. She couldn't reach him. Panic seized her for a moment, cold and sharp. Then her resolve hardened. She would not be the damsel locked in the tower. She would not be the reason he died. She found Jay, the soldier who had nearly been shot in the alley, the one whose life she had inadvertently saved. He was in charge of her security detail. "He's walking into an ambush," she said, her voice urgent, showing him the photo and the map. "Park isn't at the warehouse. He's here, at the Orpheum Theater." Jay looked at her, his expression skeptical. "The boss's intel is never wrong." "This time it is," she insisted. "This is a message. He's showing off. The car, the theater, it's a stage. He's waiting for him." Her certainty, her logic, must have convinced him. He saw the truth in her eyes. He made a call, his voice low and tense. He couldn't reach Minjun directly, but he could reroute the backup teams. He could warn the perimeter. And then he looked at her. "He will not be happy you interfered. I'd rather he be angry and alive than..." She couldn't finish the sentence. The aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. Jay's warning had been just in time. Minjun's primary team had been diverted moments before they would have walked into a heavily armed trap. The battle that followed was swift, brutal, and decisive. Park, caught in his own theatrical stage, was eliminated. His organization crumbled overnight. Amara waited in the penthouse. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray. She heard the elevator doors open and knew it was him. He walked into the living room. He was uninjured, but he looked exhausted. There was dust on his perfect suit and a small cut above his eyebrow. He stopped in the middle of the room and just looked at her. The silence was heavier than anything she had ever felt. Finally, he moved. He walked to her, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and gently touched the scar on her forearm, the one he had tended to in the alley. His thumb traced the faint white line. "My father," he began, his voice rough with exhaustion, "told me that any attachment to a person outside of this world was a liability, a weakness to be exploited." He lifted his eyes from her arm to her face. The cold, obsidian darkness was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, something she had only seen for a second in the chaos of the alley. "He was wrong," Minjun said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You are not a weakness, Samara. You are a fortress." It was not a declaration of love. It was more. It was an acknowledgement, a testament. In his world of violence and betrayal, it was the highest form of worship. He had seen her, not as a woman to be protected, but as a source of strength he never knew he needed. The cost of this new reality was absolute. Her old life was a ghost, a memory of a person she could never be again. She had traded the quiet anonymity of a waitress for the dangerous orbit of a king. She had become entangled in his empire of shadows, and there was no going back. Nothing in this world was free. He stood before the window, watching the sun claim the sky, his city laid out before him. He did not ask her to stay. He did not need to. The question had been answered in a dark alley, with a thrown purse, and confirmed with a whispered warning that had saved his life. He turned from the window, his silhouette stark against the dawn, and he held out his hand. It was not a command. It was an offer. A choice. Amara looked at his outstretched hand, at the long, elegant fingers that had orchestrated violence and had gently tended her wounds. She looked up at his face, at the man who was both monster and sanctuary. With her eyes wide open, she stepped forward and placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a silent, binding contract under the new morning light. The cold metal of the signet ring on his pinky finger pressed against her skin, a permanent, indelible claim.